Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, I got my hands on a sefer I've been trying to get my hands on for a little bit, which is the Sheirus Yaakov, which is the Rebbe's commentary on Maseches Brachos. And something I was looking at this morning that I wanted to review is with regards to the 9th parak, where it talks about a certain element of dreams. Now, we're not going to talk about the metaphysics of dreams or the analysis of dreams, but rather the nature of dreams. Because for the Rebbe, and really for tzaddikim who preceded the Rebbe, the dream state was a very fundamental space of consciousness in Chazal, especially in the Zohar HaKadosh, as well as the 9th parak of Chazal, which is seemingly a prerequisite for many of the theorists in psychology who also utilize the theory of rabbinic dream interpretation, which is that the interpretation follows the mouth of the individual, right? That the interpretation is going to be in accordance with how I choose to see it. So it speaks of the freedom of interpretation and the ability of my interpretation to kind of have a real impact on what the reality of a situation is. So this Gemara says as follows: Rabba Rami ksiv b'chalom adaber bo. I spoke to him within a dream. Kan al yidei malach. So it's a description that there's certain types of dreams. There's a dream that takes place al yidei malach, a spiritual source. And there's a dream that takes place al yidei shade, which is more of a confusing state of imagination. But the Rebbe is going to darshan as follows. He says, Yesh darga shel chalom behekayetz, right? There's an aspect or an expression of dreaming even when a person is awake. There's a famous story with the Panovich Rav, that someone came to the Panovich Rav once and asked him about his idea for Panovich Yeshiva, and he described them. They said, you're dreaming. And he says, I might be dreaming, but I'm awake. So Chazal already talk about this nature of b'chaloim behekayetz, right? Daydreaming or an engagement with imagination, even without allowing my conscious faculties to fall away. And so, Hine Rabba ba'atzma mafarish yoser b'meseches chagiga. Rabba explains in Meseches Chagiga, Sha'av sha'anoichi hastir astir panei bayom hahu, that even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu has declared that there's going to be a profound element of concealment in that day, that there's going to be a concealment of godliness, a concealment of mindfulness. B'chol zeh amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Af al pi shehistatarti panei mehem, even though I'm going to conceal my face from them, shenistalik mehem begalus, shenistalik hanevuah v'ruach HaKodesh, that there's going to be a departure of prophecy and a departure of divine inspiration, meaning to say we're not going to have those tools, those technologies that were there to give us direct access, so to speak, to godliness. B'chol zeh nishar hadarga shel chalom adaber bo. Nevertheless, there's going to remain an aspect of I shall speak to them from within a dream. Sheyesh min dveikus v'hisgalus alikus b'chalom. There's an expression of divine awareness that one can access within the dreamscape, right? Because the dream is one of the areas in consciousness that really forces us to reckon with what we conceive of as the limits of consciousness, because we tend to assume that conscious wakeful experience is the end-all be-all, and then there's what we would relegate to imagination or slice of fancy. But as the theorists who study dreams point out, and as Chazal really point out in the 9th parak, there is an inner structure to the chaos of dreams. Now, in order to see beyond the chaos of the various symptoms, right, of what is being seen in a dream, Chazal have already told us you have to get down to the basic structure of the dream, and that's where the real interpretation is going to take place. When you look in the Tefillah by Birchas Kohanim about Pitron HaChalomos, you see over there that it's really always about let my dream be transformed from darkness into light, like it happened with Bilam, like it happened with all of the other people. It's not let me create a new interpretation. It's if there is a structure to this dream, let me utilize the ingredients of that dream and transform it into something good. So b'chalom adaber bo, that there's an aspect of revelation of godliness even in a dream. U'kenira me Gemara didan, as it is apparent in this Gemara, that for certain individuals there's even a revelation. It's not a nevuah, but it's a revelation, because the dream is always comprised of devarim amitim and devarim betelim. That's the chiddush of it. It's a correlation between emes and sheker. It's not like, well, even for certain nevuah there was also an element that had to be removed, but in a dream it's really not clarified what's true and what's not true. In truth, we have to fundamentally understand, and again, understand when the Rebbe is talking, he's talking to us, that there's an idea of a waking dream. And this wakeful dream, this kind of daydreaming, this abandonment of the intellectual limits of my mind to open my mind to dimyon, for example, in my wakeful state is of a higher degree than falling into that state of slumber and unconsciousness. Why? That I can allow myself to enter into a state as if I were in a dream. Hayinu kicholmim, we were like dreamers, we weren't actually dreaming, it was like a dream. B'chinas nim v'loy nim. As Chazal has used to describe this very paradoxical state of slumber, which is you're falling asleep and you're not falling asleep at the same time. It's not quite sleepfulness, it's not quite wakefulness, but it's a combination between sleepfulness and wakefulness, or rather wakefulness at the heart of sleep, of ani yashena v'li er. That while I might be unconscious in terms of my intellectual capacity, my lave, my dimyon, is awake and functioning very well. Be'ofen sha'af shehu er, even though a person is awake, which means that my conscious mind is an active protection against the things that are frightening or that I don't want to think about. The wakeful mind is one that is structured with barriers to allow us to function in the way that we've come to function. So wakefulness implies that there's going to be a limitation, but nevertheless, but nevertheless, there's an aspect of the capacity to retrieve or draw down certain insight into godliness, certain insight into myself, that one would only be capable of getting when they were in the state of a dream. And if a person has refined and clarified their faculty of imagination, now again, the faculty of imagination is when we look in the Meir, when we look at the Rambam, when you look at the Balei Musar, so it seems that Dimyon is always going to be associated with something that is secondary to intellectual precision, right? The dream is something that is confided to a place of being lower than wisdom. But I heard this from Rav Moshe Weinberger Shlita when Rav Yisrael Salanter writes in his famous Igeres HaMusar that ha'adam chafshi b'dimyone v'aser b'sichlo, that the individual is free in their imagination and confined within their intellect. So generally speaking, that was seen as a clarion call for the value of the intellect over the dream, or over imagination, because nobody wants to be choifesh. Everybody wants to be in a state of clarity. And so what we see here is that Rav Weinberger said as follows: really what it means is that if you want to find choifesh, if you want to find actual freedom to yourself, then you have to live with imagination. Imagination is what frees a person. Imagination is what opens a person up to the possibility of thinking differently. Rav Simcha ben Reb Shischa said that the Adam, to be an individual, comes from the language of Dimyon, because the essential characteristic of being a human being is my capacity to have an imagination. The imagination and the imaginative capacity that remains stuck within my mind, that gives me the ability to dream beyond what the confines of my life say right now, that is an aspect of B'chalom Adaber Bo, that I will speak to him, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu will speak to us by way of the dream. And this aspect of the Chalom Adaber Bo, we've lost Nevuah, we've lost Ruach HaKodesh, we've lost the capacity to, paskin properly, like a person would go to a Talmud Chacham and you would have clarity, you would have Sanhedrin, but what remains is this irreducible element of creativity, this residual element of Ruach HaKodesh, of the capacity to see more than what my conscious mind is capable of. That remains in the dream. It is nishar af begalus. It remains with us even in galus. Hu bebechinas hakotel ha'ma'aravi. It's the aspect of the western wall, which the Ramchal and Ramdu Valley and the Mukubalim point out, that no matter what is destroyed with regards to the Beis HaMikdash and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, nevertheless there will always be a residual element of the Beis HaMikdash that stands in the face of all things. And that's the Kotel HaMa'aravi. Just like the Etzem Haluz, just like the pineal gland, theoretically, or the pineal bone, or that bone at the top of the spine, that place of the interconnection between the mind and the body, that remains in spite of all things. And so it's like the Kotel HaMa'aravi, where the Shekhinah never leaves from. That's the ability of us to access dreams. The Kachu Inyan HaChalom, and this is also the ability to dream while awake. And again, what we're describing dreaming while we're awake as is the ability to imagine beyond the confines and the restrictions of where I find myself right now, and the ability to see myself and to see the world as more than it actually is, in accordance with the cold tools of intellectualism and measurement. Even though we've fallen away from all elements of prophecy and divine inspiration, nevertheless, Hishir Hashem lanu b'chinas hachalom. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has left us with the irreducible element of imagination, which is that element of the dream, while I'm awake. Shu b'chinas kotel ma'aravi. It's like the kotel ma'aravi of the mind, because it's the kotel hachitzoni hamasaviv lahar habayis. Because the kotel ma'aravi was the most externalized element of the wall, but it was still connected to harabayis, which means that it contains the same principles as harabayis. V'kach b'chalom, a dream is an aspect of chitzoni shel nevuah. It's the extra or the excess of nevuah, so to speak, as Chazal tell us that the aspect of the chalom is 1/60th of nevuah, and as we know from the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, in the rules of unity, even if you have 1 out of 60, it's still considered as if you have the whole thing, because someone who is toifes, a chelik from the etzem, somebody who touches a part of the essence, in this context, a part of nevuah in the dream, then the dream is going to be an aspect of nevuah as well. And the Rebbe continues and he says as follows. Ve'inyan zeh. This aspect of the ability to dream, this aspect of the ability to draw down clarity into a space of concealment of the mind, into a space of confusion, into a space of a world gone dark, Zeh inyan b'chinas avodah shel Yosef HaTzadik. This is the avodah of Yosef HaTzadik, which we spoke about the last time, which is the nekud of ish matzliach, that a person has to have a tekifos, a belief enough in themselves to know that just as I know my loneliness, I also know my greatness. And just as I have to question the motivations of my activities, when I'm engaged in my avodas hakodesh, I have to see myself, as Rabbi Nachman described himself, as chidush kamoni lo haya me'olam. There was never a novelty quite like me. Rabbi Nachman did not write that about himself. He wrote that about himself, but he wrote that about every person who ever reads that in his book as well. And so we have to enter into the darg of Yosef HaTzadik, because we see Yosef HaTzadik found geula through what? Through Pitron HaChalomos, specifically by way of interpreting dreams. His avodah was to be Poter Chalomos. The Mittler Rebbe in Toras Chaim, in Parshas Vayechi, has just absolutely remarkable ma'amarim about the capacity to interpret a dream, which is the elevation of things that appear extra and excess and inessential to the structure, and to reveal how not only are they part and parcel of the structure, but they're the most important thing. That was the chiddush of Yosef HaTzadik. Ben Porat, Yosef ben Porata le'ayin. Poter, Porat is the same letters as Poter. It's also the same letters as Tofer, because Chanoch was a Tofer na'alayim haya, that the avodah of Chanoch was to tie shoes together to make connections where connections seem absent. So this is the inyan of Pitron HaChalomish. Yosef HaTzadik hayelei moichin the godless. Yosef HaTzadik had the ability to have moichin the godless. Why is Ben Porat Yosef moichin the godless? Rabbi Nachman points out in the second Torah, in the Haggadah there, that Porat is the same gematria as Tarpu, Tafresh Pevav, which is the same gematria of the Shem Havaya Be'arme Miluyim Ab Sag Ma Ben, which is Reish Lamed Beis 232, in addition to the Kasa Kamad Kana, the 3 Miluyim of the Shem which are the moichin of Bina. So those 7 shemos, which correspond to the Dalid of the Shem Havaya, 4 permutations, the Gimel of the Shem Eke, 3 permutations, which is why the Baal Tanya says there's a chiyuv to eat fish on Shabbos, because you want to be Makayim Dag, you want to be Mityachid with all of the shemos. The inyan of Pitron HaChalomos utilizes every aspect of the self to elevate itself out of stuckness, to uncover the hidden secrets that lie within waking consciousness. Ubekayach zeh, and it's through this strength, Hayayachol lahamtik hamoichin the katnos. What's the chiddush of a chalom? Rav Tzadok HaKohen Me'Lublin says, Mefurash, in Sidkas HaTzadik, that a chaloim is the reshimu de moichin the godless within moichin the katnas, meaning it's the irreducible trace of moments of greatness of mind that continue to exist hidden within the recesses of the loneliness of mind. Meaning we tend to see 2 categorizations, godless and katnas, greatness and smallness. Zakta tzadikim, that the secret of the chalom is the ability to uncover greatness within smallness itself. Even after nevuah has been mistalik from me, I still have the ability of uncovering something from beyond myself. And it's specifically this godless of Yosef HaTzadik, my emunah, that my thoughts are important enough for me to interpret, and my imagination is significant enough for me to take seriously. That gives me the ability to go down into moichin the katnas, go down into the constriction of mind, the nightmarish elements of dreams, the confusion, the bilbul, all of those things, which is the shorish of the dinim, which is the shorish of concealment, and most significantly the shorish of bilbulim, concealment of the mind. The bilbul, Rav Avram Abalafia says, is lave. When a person feels that their heart is moving in 2 directions and there's no uniformity in the 2 expressions of the lave, and it feels like I have 1 lave here and 1 lave there, that's bilbul. But when you have lave, it's going to be gematria yesod, which is going to be miyached, both of those elements together. And so when I have these dreams, I have the ability of what? Of clarifying the bilbulim, sheba bechinas dinei leah, ulemtzaya gila elikus, and I have the ability to clarify the darkness of that that nocturnal sense of mindlessness and uncover godliness that rests hidden within there. V'zeh soid b'chalom adaber bo. Listen to the lashon of the Rebbe here. It's amazing that it's written. This is the secret of what? This is the secret of I shall speak to them as if it were in a dream. Shenishar af begolus. This remains with us even in exile. And again, we're talking personal exile and all manners of exile. Sha'af bisman hagalus, in the bechina of Laila, even though we find ourselves in the aspect of exile, which is compared to the nocturnal reality of nighttime and concealment, where the Shechina is yored az libiyah, where the light of Elokus goes down into the worlds of separation, where Rachel hides under the bed, right, where Rachel goes down underneath the bed. She's no longer part and parcel of the Yichud, but rather she finds herself thrown to the ground. Shezeh sod hachalom. This is the secret of the dream that takes place in the depths of night. She'ein chalom lelo devarim batelim. And we know that a chalom is a treacherous area. Why? Because the very definition of a chalom is that it has insignificant elements to it. It's a chefza of sheker, meaning there's clearly something that is insignificant within it. Shad devarim batelim shabachalom. These inessential, untrue elements within the dreams of our mind, within the dreams of our thoughts. But when we find ourselves in a state of confusion, when we find ourselves in a state of not really knowing what our thoughts are trying to tell us, we have to think that instead of thinking that I'm devoid of the light of godliness from my mind right now, I have to look at it as if the light of godliness is now hidden and concealed within the confusion of my thoughts, within the confusion of my own mind, and it's my job to elevate it back up from that fallen space. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires from us specifically that we uncover the light of godliness, specifically in places of concealment. To reveal that in truth all of these worlds that appear to be separate and removed and insignificant are in truth all expressions and extensions of the Koyach of the Shechina, and it's the aspect of Rachel that continues to be king or queen over the worlds of separation in the secret of Yosef HaTzadik, who was king over Mitzrayim. Yosef HaTzadik went down into the death-bringing space of the loss of mind and fell into this space of the nightmarish territories of Meitzarim, of concealment. But what he did was he was Mahapechet L'Tova, and he began to be Poiter Chalomos. He found the Geula from within the Chalom itself. Shet Tzadik Emes, that the true Tzadik Yesh La Koach, they have the power, and all of us have the power. Legalis HaMalchus, to reveal the kingship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in spite of the fact that the appearances say it's not there, Lahamtik Kol HaMeichem Dekatnus, and to remove and to get rid of all of the small-mindedness, the Bechinas Mitzrayim, which is the aspect of Mitzrayim and the Meitzarim and the constriction. In Mitzrayim there was no Arichas Af, there was no ability to breathe because everything was Charonaf, everything was quick, and it was speedy, because everything had to be the way it was meant to be, and if it wasn't the way it was supposed to be, I had to run out of it. The secret of the Chalom is that even when it's not the way it's supposed to be, you're still fine there. You don't have to run out of it. You can sit in the Chalom. You can reveal the light of Elokus that exists within the Chalom as well. It's not only about wakefulness. A person's mind also is Halig.
In this state of Halon, I was speaking about, is there a difference maybe between like one going to sleep and having a dream because we can't have really an effect of what we're dreaming about, or if we're induced into a state of like we're dreaming in the wake state, but like a hallucinogenic or a psychedelic.
So I think, it could be that these conversations go into that space as well. For me, much more in terms of the way I understand the Rebbe's Torah is that here the inyan of a chalom is kind of like a position that we all find ourselves in, irrespective of any external access point. Meaning we have to assume that we're talking about a natural state of being that is available to each and every person. Chazal, we're not talking about individuals who needed some buy-in in order to experience this. Here, I understand the chalom as those moments in life where consciousness, to be fully conscious, is just too difficult, right? Yosef Das, Yosef Machov, when a person is fully on with the abundant attention that the mind demands to be present in a moment, it takes a lot for a person to be a bardas like this. It takes an immense amount of effort and simsum of the machshava to prevent my mind from running beyond its limits. The chalom is what happens, I understand, as when I relinquish the control, where I no longer try and control the mind, because ich ken nicht sein, I can't do it anymore. So even in that fall away from the control of the mind and what we would refer to as kavana, I'm recognizing this state of a chalom almost as not quite a misasek, not quite somebody without kavana, but I'm still kind of just like walking through life without being fully present in it. And I think that that's the state of mind that the Rebbe is talking to, at least as I understand it. right? As opposed to some active engagement with imagination. That already, for the Rebbe, there's a mahalach to all those things. That's what he writes about in his Avodas HaYichud, where it talks about breath, and it talks about falling into a slumber-like state of deep breaths and moving of the eyes. Over here, I think it's talking about much more of an existential kind of state that an individual find themselves for most of the day. Ani yishay neveli bi'er. Does that make sense?
I'm saying because nim v'loy
Nim v'loy nim.
He said the nam.
No, nim is gematria sound. It's gematria drug. So I'm just saying.
Yeah, l'chayra the Rebbe is not going there. Shatzadik emes yesh lo, shatzadik emes, the true tzaddik yesh lo koyach legalus amalchus lahamte kolamoich in the kadnus, because the tzaddik, the poiter achalomos, Yosef tzaddik, has the ability to go down into concealment and to sweeten all of that lowliness of mind in the aspect of Mitzrayim. And it's the secret of revealing the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu specifically in the place of the greatest concealment. And this is the purpose of exile, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created a deep element of concealment and slumber, that the Jewish people should be able to reveal the truth, which is what? What's the truth? What's the biggest truth of exile? That even in a place where it appears to be the very opposite of the revelation of godliness, in truth we have the ability to transform the very opposite of godliness into a place of the revelation of godliness, and to create a dir b'tachtonim daika, which means to say, as Chazal told us, and the Baal Tanya makes very famous in Parak Lamed Vav, not only is the lowest place imaginable accessible to the light of God, but it's the very sight that proves the deep expression of the light of God. That the dir b'tachtonim is not the yotzim in a klal, it's the prat that's magal, the shirish of the klal kula. Hashem can be found in levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Nishta chiddush. The biggest chiddush is when a person finds themselves at the bottom of level 10, where all rules seem to dictate that godliness is not accessible here. The chiddush of Pitron HaChalomos is that even here, even in this inessential excess of the mind, this surplus meaninglessness of existence, those things in life that appear extra, the extra of all things which calls to mind the question of excess and purposelessness and meaninglessness, because if there could be something extra that deserves to be thrown away and meant to be relegated to waste, so then didn't Hashem create everything for a purpose? So Zok the Mittler Rebbe in this famous Maimer on Pitron HaChalomos, that the chiddush of the Chalom is that there's nothing extra, even the extra is not extra, and yet it remains extra and it remains significant at the very same time. That's the chiddush of the Chalom. As we're going to see, the Chalom is like the Nekudas HaChoilem, which is the dot on top of the Vav, which is the secret that there's a dot that hovers above my mind that I have access to in spite of the fact that I don't have access to it. It hovers above me, yet I have the access to it when I draw it down into my life. And this is the Tachlis of the Galus. The Tachlis HaGalus that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created so that we could reveal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is found everywhere and that we can transform everything into a dwelling place for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, specifically down here, which is the purpose of creation. And therefore, af begalus, even in exile, nishar habechinas shel bechaloi madaber bo. There is a remainder of this expression of I shall speak to them by way of the dream. Shemizgala Hashem bechalom, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals Himself in this place of lack of clarity as opposed to clarity. Bechezyon halayla, in the aspect of someone who is wandering around in the visions of night. Shezeh bechinas shel avodas hagalus. This nighttime, this slumber-like state, this nocturnal space of the dreamscape is the very expression of exile, and our job there is to be mekasher to HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'soicha choshech, not misoicha choshech, not out of the darkness, but within the darkness itself. Shezeh bechinas avodas hagalus. This is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires of us in galus. Shakol hagalus hu kamo chalom, because the entirety of exile is simply like one elongated dream. B'toicha chalom, and within that dream v'ahester, and within that concealment, tzrichim b'nei Yisrael limtzoas Hashem Yisparach b'bechinas chalom adaber bo lehizkasher alav Yisparach. And it's our job and our responsibility to try and uncover the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu specifically within that dream. We'll end with this last paragraph where the Rebbe connects this to the Darga of Kesser. Even though this appears to be the lowest level imaginable, where I'm stuck in the confusion and the imaginings of the mind and the excess of the mind and the insignificance of the mind, nevertheless, we see that the Chalom, for all of its lowliness, is also associated with Kesser, which is all about Ratzon and Tainug, because Ein Adam Chalom Ela B'ma Shemahar Her Libo, and that the Chalom is Mukusher to what I care about and what I have pleasure in. And this is hinted to in the fact that the word for a dream is the same language as the Nikud Choylem, as the Nakuda of the Choylem, which stands on top of the Vav, which is the Nikud of the Seer of Kesser, which is associated with the element of Kesser, which is the highest point, because it stands above us. And what is the secret of Kesser? Hashra'as elikus al tachton, the presence of godliness in my mind, the ability to close my eyes deeply and not feel that I'm drawing HaKadosh Baruch Hu down, not feeling that I have to elevate myself up back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but a feeling of equanimity, a feeling of I am at peace right now because HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Shekhinah is present with me wherever I find myself. I'm not running up, I'm not moving downwards, I am present. In the secret of Hashra'ah, like we spoke about with the Avodah V'atik, is to realize that I don't even have to run anywhere. I've already have what I need. And so Al Pizeh, based on this, says the Rebbe, move on, because the Bechina of the Chalom, Adaber Bo, the secret of HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealing himself to us through the dream, through the waking dream, is the aspect of the Pitron HaChalom, of the interpretation of the dream, which is only the ability of the Tzaddik who finds within the concealment and the waste of the dream some element of the revelation of Elokus, and Shemisgala Misoichai, that he reveals the godliness that is emergent from the concealment of the dream itself. Hareza Bechinas Kedusha Kotel HaMa'aravi. And like we said, this is the holiness of the Kotel, which remains holy in spite of all destruction that surrounds it. Shalo Zaza Mimenu Shechina Af Begalus, that the Shechina did not leave even in Galus. Umoitzim Shamas Agile Elikus Shebesoicha Choshech V'Astar de Galus. And we have the ability to uncover the light of godliness that exists in the concealment and the darkness as well. And this is an incredible teaching that he takes from the Baal HaTanya, and it's also found in the Avodas Halevi in his Hakdama to Avodah Shari Avodah, where he says as follows. This is the aspect of Yonasi Tamasi, my dove, my beloved, right, my perfect one. Isa Babalatanya Lukutei Torah Parshas Veschanan. What does Yonasi Tamasi mean? This is one of my favorite teachings in the world. What does it mean, Yonasi Tamasi, that we can say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yonasi Tamasi? Shemirames alagile Eloikus shemizgale b'derech dimyon. Yonasi Tamasi, Yonasi comes from a language of Ona'ah, or Hona'as Devarim, some misleading element of experience. All of the different rules of misleading somebody with regards to monetary payments or usury or things like that is referred to as Hona'as Devarim. It's the implication of a dishonesty that is taking place. And over here, what the Baal HaTanya sees in the pasuk of Yonasi Tamasi is that even when I am in a state of Yonasi, even when I'm still in a state of lying to one degree or another, when I find myself in a state of inauthenticity and lack of clarity, nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is my tamasi. I'm still makusher to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shemramis al hagiloi elikus shemiskala b'koyach hadimyon. It hints to the revelation of godliness that is revealed in and through the imagination itself, which is the aspect of the dream. Shu l'chayra eno giloi amiti. This is not a real revelation. Ella hoina'ah. But rather it's usury, it's trickery. V'zeh lashon Yonasi, and this is language of the verse Yonasi melashon hona'ah, meaning that I'm misleading myself. And in spite of the fact that I'm misleading myself to conceive of godliness in my mind, that very allowance to be misled by my own self, to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with me, is the very real thing. That I can lie to myself and I can trick myself to come to a state of emunah in spite of the fact that I might not rationally be there. And that's nechshav, as beautiful and tamim in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. B'chol zeh, in spite of all of the trickery and the usury associated with it, nevertheless it's still going to be referred to as tamasi, my perfect one. Shazoichen b'nei Yisrael b'koyach ha-tamimus, that b'nei Yisrael have the ability through the aspect of tamimus, through the simple faith that a person has in spite of all desire for complication, libam hatahor lahashem, their purified hearts have the ability limtsoya be'emes as Hashem yisbarach b'seicha chalom, to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu within the chalom itself, this long dream of exile, shel hayunu kecholmim, this dream of exile where we're going to wake up and say it's as if we were sleeping, and it's through this strength that Bnei Yisrael are going to be zoicha to the azima le'ischoik pinu. At that point, we're going to be able to wake up with laughter, u'lishanei nurina. And so, just to end with one teaching, my Sabi used to say all the time, and I recently saw it in a sefer from Rav Shimon Schwab, is that the Torah Kadosha says that Adam HaRishon was put to sleep. Vayipel terdema al ha'adam. Right, which was the emergence of woman, which is emergence of relationships, which was the emergence of subjectivity. But what the Torah HaKadosh never says is that Adam HaRishon was woken up. It doesn't say it anywhere. And so there's an implication that I'm adayin b'chalom adaber bo. I'm adayin finding myself within the milchama, which is the same language of a chalom. Why? Because a milchama is between two warring camps, and a chalom, by definition, is comprised of two warring camps: truth and untruth, things that are real and things that are unreal. And rather than saying what our typical mindset is, get rid of the unreal, get rid of the sheker in order to find godliness. The Halom Adaber Bo is the opportunity to reveal that even in the sheker and even in the imaginings, which are insignificant, we have the capacity of finding a Kadosh Baruch Hu there as well, and we have the ability to be poiter our chalomos. This is Chazal spent a lot of time talking about very strange dreams to teach us this very thing, which is the freedom and the imagination and the capacity of our imagination to reveal godliness in ways that the mind can never theoretically reveal it on its own. Be'ezras Hashem.